Hello, my name's Clare Wichbold. I've been really interested in the suffrage story in Herefordshire since 2018. I've been involved with the Three Choirs Festival for a number of years, and in 2018, when the festival was in Hereford, we started looking at some of the stories of people who've been involved in the suffrage movement in Herefordshire. I was completely hooked. And since then, I've been looking more and more about what was happening in Herefordshire during the 19th and early 20th centuries, about the men and women who were involved in the campaign to get votes for women. Now, the first thing I want to explain is about the difference between a suffragist and a suffragette. A suffragist is somebody who has been campaigning for votes for women in a peaceful, non-confrontational way. The leader of the suffragists in the 19th century was a woman called Millicent Garrett Fawcett. She led the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies for many years. The suffragettes came on the scene in the early 1910s, and they were led by Mrs. Emmeline Pankhurst from Manchester. They confronted the police, they confronted politicians, they broke windows. They had a far more confrontational approach to trying to get votes for women. So that's the first thing I just wanted to explain, that there is a difference between the suffragists and the suffragettes. Now, in Herefordshire, interestingly enough, the first person who was really heavily involved in the suffrage movement was a man called Charles Anthony Jr. He was the son of Charles Anthony, who was the founder of the Hereford Times, the newspaper that's still running today. The family were liberal thinkers, even the girls had a very good education, and when Charles Anthony Jr. took over at the Hereford Times, he really began to explore the opportunities for women to be involved in local and in national politics. He was a liberal and very, very keen on what he could do about moving things forward for women's votes. In 1867, which is 2 years before John Stuart Mills produced his pamphlet on women's suffrage, Charles Anthony wrote a booklet called The Social and Political Dependence of Women. This was actually a remarkable piece of work for its time, and it went through at least 5 editions and was still being printed in the 1880s. In it, he tried to explain that women were quite capable of voting. They had the intelligence, they had the capacity, and in fact that many, many men who had the vote were in fact nowhere near as well qualified as women who were missing out on the opportunity. Charles was an early member of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. Despite its name, there was a membership from both men and women. In 1878, Charles organised a meeting at the Shire Hall in Hereford. On the 21st of May, several hundred people crammed into the assembly room to hear speakers from across the country. Charles chaired the meeting and introduced the women speakers who were there. The first one was Dr. Eliza Dunbar. She was a professional doctor, originally from a Scottish family who all practiced medicine, but obviously as a woman at the time she couldn't go to university. So she left the UK, she travelled to Switzerland, studied medicine there, and then came back to England. She got a job in Bristol working at the hospital, but the male doctors there opposed her appointment, even though she was quite capable of doing just as good a job as them. So she left the hospital and she actually set up a women's clinic in Bristol, looking after women and children and campaigning for social reform. And the experience made her realise that it was so important that women actually had the opportunity to get the vote and make a difference at a national level. Eliza Mary Sturge came from Birmingham. She came from a long-established family of Quakers, and it's quite remarkable how many Quaker families from across the country were involved in the suffrage movement. Eliza travelled around not just the West Country and the West Midlands, she travelled further afield talking to audiences about the need and the opportunity for women to gain the vote. Her sister as well also used to go to meetings, and Eliza came to Hereford on a number of occasions, travelled around the county, visiting lots of different places. The third speaker was Lydia Becker. She was an older woman, but again was passionate about votes for women. She was the editor of the Women's Suffrage Journal. It was a national publication which began in 1872 and was published until 1890. Sadly, it stopped being published when Lydia died. She went to Switzerland on a rest cure, having not been very well. She caught diphtheria while she was on holiday, and her grieving colleagues at the Women's Suffrage Journal decided to discontinue publication of the newspaper. Another women's newspaper didn't start getting published well into the next century, when Common Cause started being printed, and that was the new journal of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies. Another person who was at the meeting and actually went on to play a reasonably significant role in Herefordshire was the fantastically named Reverend William Duncombe van der Horst Duncombe. He was one of the vicars choral at Hereford Cathedral. He lived in the cloisters with his family, and he, by his own admission, was actually quite late to getting involved in the suffrage movement. However, he went on to be a very keen campaigner. Later on, he wrote letters about the treatment of women prisoners. He joined the Church League for Women's Suffrage, and he contributed to various funds around votes for women as time went by. One of the other things that was happening in the 19th century were parliamentary petitions. These were where local people got together a petition towards an MP who could then raise it in the House of Commons on various subjects. So things like closing pubs on a Sunday, treatment of animals, and of course women's suffrage. They were the sort of thing that people raised, and it was quite interesting to see how often treatment of animals and closing pubs on a Sunday came ahead of women's suffrage. One of the big petitions from Herefordshire was in 1883, when a number of women farmers put forward their names to try and campaign for the parliamentary vote. What would happen, of course, is that when a farmer died, his wife would inherit the property, but often would be told that she couldn't keep it because she didn't have a vote, she wasn't a man. And so in 1883, over 20 Herefordshire farming women put their names towards a petition. Now, we've got a whole list of names here, but trying to track these women down can prove quite difficult unless they've got a more unusual name. One of them in particular, Mary Ann Kendrick, I've been able to find out a bit more about her. She inherited a farm at Coddington near Ledbury, and it was over 200 acres, and she managed to keep her farm and is actually even recorded many, many years later as Mrs. Mary Ann Kendrick, farmer, and she was also growing hops on the farm. Now, it wasn't all plain sailing with the suffrage movement. Obviously, there were people here in the county who were very keen on trying to encourage votes for women, but there were other people who were against it. One of the significant figures towards the end of the 19th century was the MP for Hereford, who was Charles Radcliffe Cook. He was a definite anti, and in 1893, when he was trying to get himself voted in as the Hereford MP, he produced a very nice little election card which asked for "the favour and vote and interest is respectfully solicited by Mr. Charles W. Radcliffe Cook." On the back, it listed some of the many achievements of the Conservative Unionist government, and it talked about peace with the world, reform, and fantastic foreign policy, cheaper tea, cheaper currants and tobacco, but nowhere does it mention votes for women. And this is the problem at this sort of time in the late 19th century, the early 20th century. The National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies were campaigning quietly, ardently, but weren't actually getting anywhere with votes for women. They came close. There were various votes, but every time they were defeated. And at this point, in 1903, that's when the Women's Social and Political Union emerged. Emmeline Pankhurst lived in Manchester. Her husband died quite young, and she found herself really frustrated about not being able to vote, to carry on with various parts of the business, and so began campaigning, and as I mentioned earlier, became an ardent, militant campaigner for votes for women. Now, it was a while before the Pankhursts actually got to Hereford. They finally arrived in the city in early 1908. There was an election going on, and by then, of course, there was some violence. Some women had already been imprisoned, and it was felt to be quite inflammatory that the Pankhursts were coming to somewhere sleepy old Hereford. Anyway, they came to the city, and Christabel Pankhurst stood on a cart in the middle of St. Peter's Square and addressed the crowd. She'd been talking for about 45 minutes. Now remember, this is the end of January, so everybody had been well wrapped up. It was quite cold. She'd been talking for about 45 minutes, and then a small boy threw a rock at her. Imagine the shock. Imagine the crowd. Everything went quiet. She sat down. She checked her head. She found that her hair comb had been broken. She sat for a few minutes, and interestingly, the report in the paper describes her as being rendered partially insensible. However, she did recover. She got up again and carried on talking for about another 3/4 of an hour. I don't know how cold everybody must have been by the end of that, but there you go. Anyway, at this point, the mayor of Hereford came to apologise for her rough treatment at the hand of the small boy. Sadly, I have no idea who this small boy is. I would love to know, and if anybody does know, please let me know. And then what happened was that the Pankhursts were taken by the cheering crowds to their destination for the night, which is the Mitre Hotel in Broad Street. Well, of course, now the Mitre Hotel is Gabb's, the solicitors, and for those of you who know it, still has a balcony. And what happened was the crowds were so excited and so thrilled with the Pankhursts being there, they actually called them out onto the balcony. And so Christabel and her mother Emmeline came out onto the balcony, waved to the crowds, and then presumably retired for a good night's sleep and a stiff drink. Later in 1908, there was another visit from a different suffragette, somebody called Gladys Keevil. Now, some of you may have already seen this picture. It's a woman, again, standing on a cart in the middle of St. Peter's Square. And there has been some confusion because people previously thought the picture was Mrs. Pankhurst. Well, it isn't. It's actually Gladys Keevil, and she was here in Hereford in May 1908. She had already been in prison several times, and if you look very carefully at the picture at the bottom right, there's actually a police inspector standing there. He's wearing his cap and uniform, and he's obviously listening very intently to what Gladys is talking about to make sure she's not saying anything inflammatory to the Hereford crowd. And it's an absolutely fantastic image and certainly worth having a good look at. Now, I mentioned before about Charles Radcliffe Cooke and his opposition to votes for women. It wasn't just the male MPs who were opposed to votes for women. On the 2nd of March 1909 at Hereford Town Hall, there was a public meeting for the Women's National Anti-Suffrage League. Now, this may seem surprising that there were women who were campaigning against votes for women, but of course there were some who felt that women should be maternal, should be at home, should be caring for their husbands, should be caring for their families, and could be involved in local activities such as being poorhouse guardians or supporting the local hospital and local orphanages and things like that. But the idea of women being involved on the national parliamentary stage was an anathema to them. And so therefore the Women's National Anti-Suffrage League was set up, and the first meeting was held on the 2nd of March. Prior to that, though, the committee was organised, and that meeting took place at Eaton House, which is number 4 St John Street in Hereford. It's now actually called Ainsley House. That was the home of the, again, delightfully named Mary Cochrane King, hyphenated King. She was a very keen anti-suffragist and invited a very special speaker to come to Hereford for the meeting. And this is Mary Angela Dickens. She was the granddaughter of the novelist Charles Dickens, and she spent her years, many years, travelling around the country to spread the message of anti-suffrage. She spoke in Hereford. She was a founder member of the Portsmouth branch, because of course that's where Dickens came from, of the Women's National Anti-Suffrage League, and worked incredibly hard to oppose votes for women. The crowd that came to listen to her, a lot of them were actually intrigued by the novelty of having somebody with a direct connection to Charles Dickens, and I think many of them actually just went to the meeting at the Shire Hall so they could say they'd seen a Dickens. And in fact, there was a newspaper report about a woman who went to the meeting just so she could say that she'd seen her, a bit like people who, you know, go to see a celebrity today, which is quite fascinating. At that point in Hereford, the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies hadn't actually got a branch, and seeing the success of the meeting of the Anti-Suffrage League, on the 29th of May, the Hereford Times reported about the start of the suffragist movement in Hereford. So, various women came to Hereford on behalf of the national campaign, and they came to Bredwardine for an open-air meeting. And the chair of the meeting was Miss Burton Phillipson, who lived at the cottage in Bredwardine. So really, the suffragist movement in Herefordshire began in Bredwardine. So there's a really nice local story there. There were other meetings held in Hereford, and one of the people who eventually took a post for the local society was Miss Mabel Chave. Now again, that's probably a name you recognise, because of course there's Chave and Jackson, the chemist in Broad Street, and Mabel was one of the family. So there we are, as I said, the origins of the suffrage movement in Herefordshire in Bredwardine. Now, I've tried to find out a bit more about Eleanor Burton Phillipson. She's actually quite elusive. She doesn't appear to have actually joined the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, and all I've really got for her is the census entry from 1911. And she was living at a place called The Cottage in Bredwardine. Now, I've not been able to track that down. I have to say it's not much of a cottage because it actually had 12 rooms. But Eleanor was living there with her invalid sister and a nurse and a couple of servants. And apart from later on, when I found mention of her death, there's very, very little to identify her being involved in the suffrage movement. So it's interesting in itself that she hosted the meeting. She had people there at her house. We have no idea how many people turned up for the meeting, but then sadly she disappears into obscurity. Now, of course, I'm speaking to you from Mockers Church, and so really what I'd like to do now is to talk some more about the church's involvement in the women's suffrage campaign. In 1909, the Church League for Women's Suffrage was founded by the Reverend Claude Hinscliffe and a woman called Maud Royden. Now, they were very anxious at that time about how they could tie in both social reform with women's suffrage, and they were also getting more and more concerned about how women were being treated in prison when they had been arrested for campaigning for the vote. So the Church League for Women's Suffrage grew very, very rapidly. That was the Anglican church organisation, and soon had membership of clergy, of women, and people from across the country. They produced a newspaper on a monthly basis, the Church League for Women's Suffrage, and got contributions from all sorts of people. And the picture shows an issue from September 1912, and one of the people who was contributing towards the newspaper was actually connected with Hereford. I'll come on to him shortly. The other thing to say, though, of course, that was the Anglican Church who was involved in campaigning. It wasn't just the Church League for Women's Suffrage. There was a Catholic Women's Suffrage Society. There was a Jewish League for Women's Suffrage, and the Free Church League for Women's Suffrage as well. And the religious leagues, prior to the First World War, campaigned together on many, many occasions, held rallies, and this picture shows representatives from the different religious leagues all together in London for a protest in 1913. One of the most significant Catholic speakers was a woman called Alice Abbadam. She originally came from where the National Botanic Gardens of Wales are now. Her family owned that property. But she travelled a lot and spoke in many places and came to Herefordshire on more than one occasion as well. The leading figure in Herefordshire for the Church League for Women's Suffrage was John Percival. He was Bishop of Hereford. He came to Herefordshire in the mid-1890s, and of course at that time Hereford was considered to be a bit of a political backwater for a liberal bishop like John Percival. However, he began to try and instigate some social reform and was certainly in support of votes for women. Prior to coming to Hereford, he'd actually been involved in the founding of Clifton College in Bristol and was very progressive in his thinking. He was a bit of a shock, I think, for quite a few of the clergy in Herefordshire, but certainly worked extremely hard to try and bring around social reform and be a very active member of the Church League for Women's Suffrage. He founded Percival Hall in St Owen Street, which is where the Breast Cancer Haven is now. And that was where the Young Women's Christian Association was based and was the venue for many, many talks and campaigns around women's suffrage. And indeed, Alice Abbadam, who I mentioned previously, actually spoke at Percival Hall on more than one occasion. The bishop, of course, he lived at the palace in Hereford, but he used to spend a lot of time in London and was often to be found speaking in the House of Lords and making his views known. And in 1913, he was part of a very active campaign by clergy against what came to be known as the Cat and Mouse Act. This was where women prisoners who had gone on hunger strike would be released from jail to recover for a few days and then be rearrested and put back. So almost like a cat playing with a mouse and then playing with it a bit more, letting it go, catching it. And so the Cat and Mouse Act was seen as a really, really difficult thing for people to come to terms with. And so the Bishop of Hereford was protesting about it, and Reverend Duncombe, who I mentioned early on, he was another campaigner against the Cat and Mouse Act. Now just round, of course, from the Bishop's Palace are the cathedral cloisters. That was the home of Reverend Duncombe, but he wasn't the only person who was campaigning for votes for women. In 1911, a clergyman and his wife arrived in Hereford who really shook things up. The Reverend George Herbert Davis and his wife Ethel Davis were previously in Birmingham. They were both members of the Independent Labour Party. They were involved in all sorts of campaigns in Birmingham itself and were members of the Women's Social and Political Union, so were certainly active and militant, and indeed Ethel was remarkably militant, as I'm going to tell you. Sadly, we don't have any pictures at all of Ethel, but we do have this one picture of a group of people at the cloisters in Hereford, including right over on the left-hand side, Reverend Davis. He's standing there with their youngest daughter, Molly. Now, Reverend Davis was obviously given a great deal of slack when he was at Hereford because he crops up speaking all over the country. He was in Cardiff one week, he was in Workington another time, he was in London at meetings, and he was constantly travelling around and hopefully doing a few services here at Hereford Cathedral in support of votes for women. Ethel, in the meantime, was at home looking after the family, but also campaigning here in Herefordshire about votes for women and was the secretary of the WSPU for Hereford. Now, I mentioned the Church League for Women's Suffrage newspaper. I'd also said about the Women's Suffrage Journal. The militant publication was called Votes for Women, no mistaking what that one was. And there was a campaign in 1912 to have the newspaper on the reading room table at Hereford Library. Now, the town council turned it down. They didn't want the Votes for Women newspaper on the table in the library in case it gave people ideas, turned their heads, made them start smashing windows in Hereford, who knows. So what happened was that at the May Fair in 1912, a number of women, including Ethel, had a stall to sell the newspaper. They decorated it with lilac for violet, for the colour, for the women's suffrage movement. They had white hawthorn and they had green foliage, so they had the green, white and violet colours on their stall. And they sold lots and lots of copies of the Votes for Women newspaper, and they also sold dainty handmade articles to raise money. Now, what these dainty handmade articles are, I have no idea, but at some point, hopefully, we can find out. Coverage of the May Fair, in some respects, is difficult to find out about. There's lots of pictures of the rides, there's lots of people having fun. Sadly, there is no photograph or anything at all to show the women's stall in 1912. However, the Huntley Film Archive has got some footage of the May Fair from 1912. At the start of it, there's a woman dressed in white with a small child and another woman who go and stand on a ride. They don't actually go on the ride, they look across from where the ride is as though they're trying to check something out. And I wonder if that's Ethel with little Molly and somebody else who's running the stall, just standing up somewhere higher to have a look, to see how the stall looked with its hawthorn, with its lilac and with its green foliage. Now, Reverend George Herbert Davis, as I mentioned, was travelling around the country doing many talks, and in 1913 he was involved in something which caught the nation, both their imagination but also their horror. On the 2nd of June 1913, Emily Wilding Davidson went to Epsom and tried to cross the course, tried to stop the King's horse, tried to commit suicide. We will never know what her intentions were, but as a result of the injuries she received, Emily Wilding Davidson died several days later in hospital. She was actually a member of the Church League for Women's Suffrage and also a member of the WSPU, and was known for her extreme militant views. She even scared the Pankhursts with some of her behaviour. But of course, when she died, she was seen as a martyr to the cause. And so her funeral was held at St George's Church in Bloomsbury in London. And thousands of people lined the streets. There were women there from all over the country. There were flowers. It was an amazing set-piece event. And several clergymen officiated at the funeral. One of them was, indeed, Reverend George Herbert Davis from Hereford Cathedral. And so he felt that even though there was all this uncertainty about the death of Emily Wilding Davidson, he would go to that funeral and he would be part of that service. Afterwards, Emily Wilding Davidson was taken to Morpeth, where her family lived, and she was buried there. And people still go to visit her grave today, all these years later. Another of the clergymen who was slightly late to the party in Herefordshire, but again had a significant role in campaigning, was Canon Alfred Lilly. He had been in London for many years, working in the Paddington area, so knew the issues around poverty and social deprivation. However, he also was friends with Oscar Wilde, which is quite an interesting relationship to have. He was invited to come to Hereford in 1913 by Bishop Percival. And of course, he again was a clergyman with liberal views who shook the place up. and caused quite a lot of controversy with his presence. However, eventually he became the Archdeacon of Ludlow, and people began to really warm to him, because even though he'd spent many, many years in London and seemed to have quite progressive liberal views, he turned out to be a really excellent country clergyman. Now, of course, when he came to Hereford, he was given a place to live, and the house that he had was number 3 St John Street. Now, of course, earlier on, I mentioned about the anti-suffrage movement in Herefordshire, and Miss Cochrane King, hyphenated King. She lived at number 4. Now, something tells me I don't think there would have been many invitations for tea with Canon Alfred Lilly at number 3 and Miss King at number 4. The Dean of Hereford at the time, Dean Lee, was quite conflicted in his approach to women's suffrage. He was married to an American woman who was very keen on the vote. However, he himself had to tread a very fine line about what was happening in terms of how prayer and services were approached at Hereford Cathedral. In 1913, on the 1st of February, there was going to be a service of prayer and reconciliation held in the cathedral for votes for women. Now, a petition was got together and handed to the Dean to try and stop this taking place. Now, quite remarkably, the petition was put together by the daughter of the previous Bishop of Hereford to John Percival, Bishop Attlee. Mrs. Harrison had been widowed quite young, and she had become quite a firm anti-suffragist, despite the fact that both her father and mother were keen suffrage supporters. And Mrs. Harrison's explanation for the petition, she was concerned that women would get into the cathedral, break windows and damage the memorial to her father, which is in the north transept of the cathedral. Now, of course, the Dean decided at this point that he couldn't possibly let this service go ahead, and so it was cancelled. The news of this actually made the Times, but also the anti-suffrage papers, who were very, very excited about the fact that the Dean had not bowed to these dreadful women who wanted to try and get votes for women, and other cathedrals should do exactly the same and ban services. The final thing that I'd like to talk about is one significant figure who was involved in the Church League for Women's Suffrage and came from Hereford. Florence Canning was the daughter of the Vicar of Tupsley. She was born in 1863, the eldest of a family, and she moved away from Hereford but never lost her Hereford roots. St Paul's Church at Tupsley was built in the early 1860s, and her father, Thomas Canning, was the first vicar there. It was a new church. He also founded a school. He, again, was very keen on social reform, and certainly it made a big impact on Florence in terms of what she did in the future. She and her sister Ethel travelled extensively. They even, as far as we can see, went to Japan. And then Florence came back to England and became an artist. But then when the WSPU was founded, something flicked a switch and she gave it all up and she became a militant suffragette. Now, I don't know what her mother would have thought. By this time her father had died, but further research has revealed, in fact, that her mother was actually a keen suffragist, even if she didn't go as far as being a suffragette. Florence was involved in various protests and deputations, and she actually got sent to prison in 1908. She was part of a group of women who went from Caxton Hall to try and go to the House of Commons to ask once again, for however many times it was, about the vote to be given to women. The police arrested a number of the women, and Florence spent a month in Holloway jail. The women were actually released on the 31st of July 1908, and the image shows a charabanc taking a number of women to their breakfast when they were released. First thing in the morning was when the women were always let out of jail. And on the back of the charabanc, looking towards the camera, wearing a black hat, and with a black collar on her coat, is Florence. So she just spent a month in Holloway and was going to have breakfast. After this, she became far more involved in speaking. She travelled around the country. She even went as far as the Isle of Skye to do campaigning there. And research has shown that during her active campaigning lifetime, she did over 300 speaking engagements. In April 1909, Florence went to Eagle House, which was also known as the Suffragettes' Rest. That was run by Colonel and Mrs. Blathwaite, who were keen suffrage supporters. They invited suffragettes to stay there to recuperate from time in prison, just to get some rest, just to be able to spend some time quietly away from the hurly-burly of campaigning. What they also did was encourage the suffragettes to plant trees in their garden, and the picture shows Florence in the process of planting a tree. The woman on the right-hand side of the picture is in fact Annie Kenny, who's one of the few working-class suffragettes. All the trees are now gone. Unfortunately, in the 1960s, when the area was being developed at Bath Easton, all the trees were chopped down and a housing development replaced them. However, some of the plaques that were put by the trees were rescued, and there's this fantastic series of photographs that were taken by Colonel Blathwaite. Unfortunately, they didn't get lost. Florence, even though she was a militant suffragette and a member of the WSPU, became heavily involved in the Church League for Women's Suffrage. And on the 2nd of July 1913, the General Council held a meeting in Brighton. And the woman photographer, Muriel Darton, was invited to take a photograph of all the women and the clergymen who were there for that meeting. Remarkably, this picture survives and is held in the archives at the Women's Library. In the middle of the picture is Florence Canning. It's absolutely amazing to be able to see her standing there, surrounded by all these people. Some of the clergymen who were there include the Bishop of Kensington, the Bishop of Lincoln, who was the president of the Church League for Women's Suffrage. The founder of the Church League is there, the Reverend Claude Hinscliffe. The Bishop Edmund Nathaniel Powell is there. And in fact, over on the far left-hand side, in his cream-coloured blazer, is Reverend Alfred Lilly. So he'd already started at Hereford Cathedral, but he managed to make his escape as well and went to Brighton. He's standing next to the Bishop of Kensington. It is just a marvellous picture, and the more you look, the more you see. And the most remarkable thing of all about this picture is at the bottom right-hand side, there are two Indian women in the picture. They are Susila Banerjee and we think her sister Nalini. Susila was secretary to the Church League for Women's Suffrage in Ealing, and her sister was actually living in Liverpool and working there as a doctor. And they both were campaigners. And it's really, really unusual to actually see the presence of Indian women involved in the campaign in this country. Some people will have heard of Princess Sophia. She was a member of an Indian royal family and goddaughter to Queen Victoria. She became a very militant suffragette, but the Banerjee sisters, they were the quiet campaigners and campaigning just gently, quietly, but actively through the Church League for Women's Suffrage. Florence Canning, unfortunately, never got to see women get the vote. She had cancer. In fact, she had breast cancer. And at the time, it was thought that that was caused by her injuries from being part of the demonstrations when the police would roughly handle the women as they were trying to make their protest. She died on Christmas Eve, 1914, and Her coffin came back to Hereford with a suffragette wreath on it, and she was taken to St Paul's at Tupsley and is buried in the churchyard there. She had a suffragette funeral. Today you can still go and see her grave. It's by the path not far from the church entrance. Unfortunately, some time ago, nobody knows quite when, the cross has been knocked off the top of the grave, and I have to say that at some point in the future, when I can actually get round to it, there's a crowdfunding project there to get Florence's grave restored as one of the really significant members of the suffrage movement. So, when did it all finally happen? The Representation of the People Act was finally passed by Parliament on the 6th of February 1918. When you think back, Charles Anthony, 1867, and his pamphlet on the social and political dependence of women, it took that long for women of a certain age and a certain standing to get the vote. Of course, there were men as well who still weren't entitled to vote, and it wasn't until 1928 when equal suffrage finally became a reality. Thank you.